Chairman, thank you. Thank you all for sharing your expertise and intellect this morning. A commonly held concern with FHFA continuing to serve as the sole regulator of Fannie and Freddie is that they will control their regulator and hold a high degree of influence. Having said that, one of the key points on the ongoing GSE reform debate centers around a consensus on the need for caps on market share control for current and future federally chartered guarantors. This is a bit of what you were talking about with Senator Brown. Do you see a multiple guarantor model as sufficient to ensure that Freddie and Fannie do not control FHFA as their sole regulator, and that regulatory decisions will be made in the best interest of the secondary mortgage market as a whole?
Thank you. Right now, it appears that FHFA is not at the behest of Fannie and Freddie.
Okay.
We can't say what the future will be. But I do believe that the SIFMU designation helps address that problem. It helps address that problem because there are other entities, and indeed the full coordination of Treasury and other entities, including the Fed, that can step in if that becomes a problem.
Thank you. Anyone else? Mr. Pollack?
Thank you, Senator. As I said in my testimony, I think a danger with a specialized housing regulator is that it becomes captured by the idea of promoting and cheerleading for housing, or be captured by its regulated entities. And therefore, the notion that a systemic level of regulation is also key, I think is important. And it's quite clear the FHFA is neither empowered nor able to be a systemic risk regulator for the systemic risk created by Fannie and Freddie. That's according to the statute assigned to the Fed. I will say this, Susan, if you'll agree to make Fannie and Freddie SIFIs under Title I, I think we could make them under SIFMUs under Title VIII too.
Okay.
And they could both be SIFIs and SIFMUs.
Who says that compromise can't be found in the United States Senate?
How can I sit between two such reasonable people?
And you have already said you're not so sure that they should be SIFIs.
So I think a couple of things. There is a broad agreement that designation is appropriate, and that's a unique position for me. I have been pretty vocal in my concerns about the existence of the FSOC and its inability to actually identify systemic risk, measure it, control it, and so it's on a mission that it may not be equipped to pursue. This is the one place where systemic risk is historically present. This is the one place I'm very comfortable with the designation, and the details of it, I think, are left to be determined. The second thing I'd mention, if there are going to be more entities and there will be more competition somehow defined among these guarantors, the key issue is how much capital those guarantors are going to hold. If you have a downturn and you have these sort of large leveraged entities, the number isn't going to matter. You're going to have a systemic problem coming out of real estate. We've seen that in history. If you have a lot of equity behind things, you can have a big downturn and survive it. The best example of that is the dot-com bubble. The collapse of the dot-com bubble was a loss in wealth comparable to the collapse in the housing market. It produced a mild recession in the early 2000s. The collapse of the housing bubble produced the Great Recession. The difference is leverage and debt, and you have to control that, and if you control that, you'll control the problem.
Thank you. Mr. Pollack, you impressed me. I noticed the degrees in philosophy. I've never met a philosopher who answered the questions, presented his testimony in a way that was so understandable for me by outlining the question and providing a yes answer following each question. So thank you. Let me ask this one. Expand on the impact of designating Fannie and Freddie as SIFIs. What would the impact be on getting them out of the balance sheet business and back to the guarantor business? I'm sorry, the guarantee business.
Thank you, Senator, for your kind comment and for the good question. The main effect is putting FSOC in a position to look at Fannie and Freddie as systemic risks, as systemically important, which they obviously are, in my opinion, and to bring in the Federal Reserve as systemic risk regulator of Fannie and Freddie. Now, if you believe in the theory of the Dodd-Frank Act, and while it may have many shortcomings, I think it's right in this. There is a level of analysis and risk control which is systemic, which is different from individual entity regulation. And for that, I think the Federal Reserve, relative to Fannie and Freddie, would be a good choice to bring them in through designation, as SIFIs under Title I, and maybe as SIFMUs too, because they then have the systemic view of how Fannie and Freddie are affecting the system as a whole, which is the fundamental theory of Dodd-Frank and why SIFIs are in there in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.